As the dean of Harvard Law School, I express the sense of great joy and honor that we have in welcoming one of the truly most significant political philosophers of our time to deliver the Dewey Lecture here. Thomas Nagel has tackled the hardest questions with acuity, wisdom, and humor. Absurdity is one of the most human things about us, a manifestation of our most advanced and interesting characteristics, he tells us. Whether absurd or not, he offers us arresting and memorable insights that alter how we see and know. He also said, "It is often remarked that nothing we do now will matter in a million years. But if that is true, then by the same token, nothing that will be the case in a million years matters now. In particular, it does not matter now that in a million years, nothing we do will matter." University professor, professor of philosophy, professor of law at New York University. He is a hero for all who care about political philosophy, about ethics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. Among his many honors is an honorary degree from this very institution, and so we claim him as an alum. He also pursued his graduate work here. From the possibility of altruism to mortal questions, from equality and partiality to the myth of ownership, his analyses offer secular philosophy and the religious temperament. His analyses defend and elevate the view from nowhere and help us to understand what it all does mean, and wonderfully, how to demonstrate the last word. I'm using the titles of his books, if you can't tell. In fact, he demonstrates how the last word is really the beginning of great conversations. How splendid that we have a Dewey lectureship to woo him here. John Dewey, American philosopher, psychologist, educational reformer, made critical advances in ethics, logic, metaphysics, epistemology, and social theory without drifting too far from the problems of daily human life and society. The Dewey Lectures were established here in honor of John Dewey, and prior Dewey lecturers include J.G.A. Pocock, Michael Walzer, Martha Nussbaum, Jan Elster, Robert George, and Shauna Schifrin. How amazing that we get here to add Tom Nagel to that list of distinguished figures. While a very different theorist than John Dewey, he has many of the same qualities. Indeed, if in field after field, the works of the two figures are pivotal. And I just want to say that in my own work, Tom Nagel's distinction between knowledge and acknowledgement is central. Please, Tom, accept our acknowledgement here of your tremendous and indispensable contributions. Everyone, please join me in saluting Tom Nagel.
Thank you, Dean Minow, for that very generous and kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here and to see so many old friends. The philosopher Stuart Hampshire served in British military intelligence during World War II. And when we were colleagues at Princeton, he told me about the following incident, which must have taken place shortly after the Normandy landings. The French resistance had captured an important French collaborator who was thought to have information that would be useful to the Allies. Hampshire was sent to interrogate him. When he arrived, the head of the resistance unit told Hampshire he could question the man, but that when he was through, they were going to shoot him. That's what they always did with these people. He then left Hampshire alone with the prisoner. The man said immediately that he would tell Hampshire nothing unless Hampshire guaranteed that he would be turned over to the British. Hampshire replied that he could not give such a guarantee. So the man told him nothing before he was shot by the French. Another philosopher to whom I told this story commented dryly that what it showed was that Hampshire was a very poor choice for this assignment. But I introduce it not in order to try to determine whether Hampshire did the right thing in failing to lie to the prisoner in these circumstances. I introduce it as a real-life example of the force of a certain type of immediate moral reaction. Even those who think that Hampshire should, for powerful instrumental reasons, have made a false promise of life to this man facing certain death, can feel the force of the barrier that presented itself to Hampshire. It is an example of the sort of moral gut reaction that figures prominently in the recent literature of empirical moral psychology. I assume that a scan of Hampshire's brain at the time would have revealed heightened activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Much hard intellectual effort has gone into the delineation of the protective boundaries around people that ordinary morality says we must not cross. Usually the examples designed to call forth our intuitions are more artificial than this, as in the famous trolley problem. But the phenomenon is real and an inescapable part of human morality. I am interested in the question of how to decide what authority to give to these moral judgments, or perceptions, or intuitions. What kind of thinking can lead us either to affirm them as correct and fundamental, or to detach from them so that we come to regard them as mere appearances without practical validity, or alternatively, perhaps, to step back from them, but nevertheless allow them some influence in our lives that is not fundamental but derived from other values. This problem has been around for a long time, and much of what I say about it will be familiar, but recent discussion prompts another look. It is a question of moral epistemology, not the kind of epistemological question posed when we consider how to respond to a general skepticism about morality or about value, but an epistemological question internal to moral thought. There is a venerable tradition of skepticism about whether any moral judgments or the intuitions that support them can be regarded as correct or incorrect, rather than as mere feelings of a special kind that we express in the language of morality. I am not going to enter into that larger debate here. I will proceed on the assumption that it makes sense to try to discover what is really right and wrong, and that moral intuitions provide prima facie evidence for answers to such questions. The problem I want to discuss arises because for some of our most powerful intuitions, there are various possible explanations, both moral and causal, that would, if correct, undermine their claim to fundamental authority. The claim that those convictions should be taken at face value as perceptions of the moral truth. Challenges of this kind present us with the task of finding a way to conduct ourselves that is consistent with the best understanding of ourselves from outside, as biological, psychological, social, or historical products. I should offer some excuse for discussing so general a question in this setting. The problem is relevant to law because in liberal constitutional regimes, many of the rights and protections of the individual against the exercise of collective power appear initially as intuitive boundaries of this type. Freedom of religion, freedom of thought and expression, freedom of association, sexual and reproductive freedom, protections of privacy, prohibitions of torture and cruel punishment are all supposed and are all supported and in part identified by an immediate sense of what may and may not be done to people, a constraint that precedes cost-benefit calculations. Even though it is possible to construct more or less plausible consequentialist justifications, justifications in terms of long-term costs and benefits for strict legal rules embodying such protections, that is not the moral aspect under which they immediately present themselves. The violation of an individual right seems wrong in itself and not merely as the transgression of a socially valuable strict general rule. The question is whether this is an illusion, a natural illusion built into our moral psychology. Though Hampshire's uncrossable boundary arose in the context of an individual decision, it feels similar to that which bars the state from employing torture to get information, even against its enemies and for reasons of national security. And as we have seen recently, the bar against torture is contested even in our society. I have a lot of sympathy with the classic intuitionist W.D. Ross when he says, quote, "To ask us to give up at the bidding of a theory our actual apprehension of what is right and what is wrong seems like asking people to repudiate their actual experience of beauty at the bidding of a theory which says only that which satisfies such and such conditions can be beautiful," unquote. Still, some move into theory seems unavoidable in response to the deep disagreements that repeatedly emerge in relation to this subject. John Rawls gave the name reflective equilibrium to the process of putting one's moral thoughts in order by testing general principles against considered judgments about particular cases and adjusting both until they fit more or less comfortably together. The process does not treat particular judgments as unrevisable givens, nor general principles as self-evident axioms, so it need not be conservative. It can lead to radical revisions of some of the considered judgments with which we begin. But it must take intuitive value judgments as starting points, and in order to dismiss some of those judgments as mistaken, it must rely on others, just as we must rely on perceptual evidence when dismissing some perceptual appearances as illusions. I think there is no alternative to this method for pursuing answers to moral questions in which we can maintain some confidence, even in the face of disagreement. While the process is structurally similar to that of testing empirical hypotheses in the natural or social sciences against observational evidence, there is a crucial difference. In the scientific case, we understand our perceptual observations to be the result of causal interaction with the world we are investigating. Even though we haven't solved the mind-body problem and don't understand how the brain produces conscious experience, we have a rough conception of ourselves as organisms causally embedded in the world whose constituents and laws we are trying to discover. So how things seem from our perceptual point of view clearly provides data for such an investigation. However, in the moral case, we do not take our evaluative intuitions to be the result of causal interaction with the moral domain, and it is not clear what other kind of embeddedness or access to the moral truth moral judgment might involve. As is often observed, moral judgment has this in common with logical and mathematical judgment, which are also not the result of our causal interaction with the realms of logic and mathematics. Knowledge arrived at just by thinking is mysterious, but I'm going to leave aside the large and difficult question of how this is possible and concentrate on more specific issues. Here are the familiar features of ordinary moral thought that give rise to our problem. We evaluate many different kinds of things, but important among them are states of affairs or outcomes on the one hand, and actions or policies on the other. To evaluate states of affairs, we use the concepts of good and bad, better and worse. To evaluate actions, we use, in addition, the concepts of right and wrong. The classical problem is whether there is an independent aspect of morality governing the rightness and wrongness of acts and policies, either of individuals or of institutions, or whether the only truly fundamental values are good and bad, in which case standards of right and wrong must be explained instrumentally by identifying the types of actions and policies that lead to good and bad outcomes. The latter possibility was given the name consequentialism by Elizabeth Anscombe, and its best-known version is utilitarianism. The opposite view, that the right is at least in some respects independent of the good, doesn't have a name, but the principles that it identifies are usually called deontological, an ugly word, but we seem to be stuck with it. Deontological principles say that whether an act is morally permitted, prohibited, or required often depends not on the goodness or badness of its overall consequences, but on intrinsic features of the act itself. In a case like Hampshire's, the calculation of probable consequences is clearly in favor of lying to the prisoner. So if it would be wrong to do so, it would have to be for some other reason. The coexistence in ordinary moral thought and discourse of these two types of evaluation is the starting point for moral reflection that might lead us to a new equilibrium. If we take both consequences and deontology seriously as guides to conduct, they will naturally present us often with the sense of a dilemma. When a deontological prohibition against killing the innocent, against breach of promise, against betrayal, blocks an act which would prevent a greater evil or produce a great good, we are likely to still feel the force of the reason to promote the good, which makes it tempting to violate the prohibition. I believe the sense of moral conflict in these cases arises naturally and is not just a philosophical artifact. One possible response to such a dilemma is simply to take the consequentialist reasons as decisive and to decide that they should override the deontological intuition, which is construed as a form of moral squeamishness or a groundless taboo. Yet without more explanation, this all-consequentialist response would be arbitrary. The problem arises because we have both types of moral intuition, and if we are going to let one type override the other, It could just as easily go in the opposite direction. We could decide that the principle that one should always do what will have the best overall consequences is shown to be wrong by the obvious impermissibility of using certain means, like torture, to achieve good ends. The conclusion would be that to allow good and bad outcomes always to determine right and wrong is an illusion, perhaps an illusion about what is demanded by rationality. Merely pitting the intuitions against each other results in a standoff. To decide which of them to credit and which, if any, to throw out, we must do more. For each side of the dilemma, we must consider the pros and cons, both how to make the best sense of these types of judgments and how most convincingly to undermine their authority. On the positive side, it is easiest to explain the meaning of consequentialist values, as in utilitarianism. Each of us has direct access to the goodness or badness of certain things in our own lives, such as pleasure and pain, freedom and coercion, survival and death. Once we accept the crucial judgment that such things are objectively good and bad, the imagination allows us to extend these values to similar features of the lives of others. There seems no reason to weigh a given quantity of pleasure or pain differently depending on who undergoes it. So the obvious way to compare the value of two states of affairs is to add up the good or bad in the lives of all those involved and see which has the higher net balance. That then is the one we should prefer and, if possible, bring about. Good is preferable to bad, and better is preferable to worse. Whether or not they are correct, consequentialist value judgments are unmysterious. The positive interpretation of deontological values is less transparent, but I believe we can give them a definite sense. When we think in this way about how to value others, it is their status as autonomous beings independent of us that is central, not their susceptibility to pleasure and pain or other good or bad things that might happen to them. These requirements govern our direct interaction with each other person. They determine how we may treat him rather than what we should want to happen to him. The basic idea is that we must regard each person as immune from subjection to others, including ourselves, the center of a morally protected sphere of individual autonomy that can be granted equally to everyone. Each of us respects this autonomy in others most fundamentally, not as a good that we should promote, but as a boundary that we must not violate. This idea of inviolability seems clear even if there are significant uncertainties in the precise shape of the deontological boundaries. There is room for indeterminacy and ongoing reflection here as elsewhere. So far, this is merely an interpretation of deontology as an intelligible way of valuing other people, not a proof of its correctness. But in that respect, it is on the same footing as the interpretation of consequentialism I offered above. I should mention that a significant project in moral theory has been to give such deontological principles a contractualist foundation, something that is attempted in different ways by Kant, Rawls, and Scanlon. This is too large a topic for me to take up here, except to say that I think the contractualist demand for an idealized unanimity must be based on something like the equal autonomy that I have described. How does all this bear on the question of when to trust our intuitions? According to this account, our deontological convictions that certain things may not be done to people are just the subjective experience of running up against objective boundaries of inviolability that define a systematic form of value. Hampshire evidently felt that to manipulate the prisoner by falsely promising him his life was something he just could not do even to an enemy. It is phenomenologically more complex than the feelings of impartial sympathy for the pleasures and pains of others that would motivate an obedience to utilitarian requirements, but it is intelligible as a response to a different kind of value that humans possess. Thus far, there is something to be said on the positive side for both types of intuitions, consequentialist and deontological. However, this is not the end of the story. I said that it would be necessary to examine the pros and cons for both types of intuition, and the most interesting arguments are those which claim to undermine the authority of some of our intuitive starting points, especially the deontological ones. Let me describe two. The first is a theory due to David Hume, which doesn't seek to discredit deontological requirements, but tries to show that they are not morally basic, because they can be explained in terms of other values. The theory is called rule consequentialism, or in one of its more specific versions, rule utilitarianism. It purports to vindicate many of our deontological intuitions about property, contract, promise, political obligation, and various individual rights by attributing them to our having internalized certain conventions with strict rules that serve the general interest. The theory is presented by Hume in his account of what he calls the artificial virtues. And its point is that these moral requirements do not have a foundation independent of the general good of society. They seem to need such a foundation only because the general good of society requires strict rules, such as the rules of property and contract, that can serve their consequentialist purpose only if they are followed, even when their violation in an individual case would produce more good than harm. The utility of the rule in creating security and predictability demands that utility not be considered in deciding whether to adhere to it in each individual case. Participants in these conventions who have internalized the rules experience the wrongness of stealing and promise breaking as simple and intrinsic. But those requirements do not wear their true meaning on their sleeves. Their conventionality and their consequentialist foundations are hidden, and this too is an aid to their effectiveness. Although I believe it cannot give a fully adequate account of rights and deontology, thinking about Hampshire's case, for example, this theory is a brilliant contribution to moral philosophy. It offers to explain deontological requirements in a way that also opens the possibility of revision of those requirements if the good of society would be better served by modification of the governing conventions and rules. I believe rule consequentialism is at least part of the truth about rights and deontological obligations. This is strongly supported by the fact that societies that have abandoned the protection of individual rights in order to leave their hands free for the more effective pursuit of the general good have some of the most dismal records with respect to its actual achievement. Rule consequentialism doesn't seek to eliminate deontology, but tries to show that it is not morally fundamental. But a second, more negative criticism of anti-consequentialist moral intuitions has recently become prominent. It is found in the writings of certain psychologists, notably Daniel Kahneman, Jonathan Haidt, and Joshua Green, who have turned their attention to the psychological analysis of moral judgment and motivation, and also to their neurophysiological, evolutionary, or sociological underpinnings. The approach has also been taken up by non-psychologists like Peter Singer and Cass Sunstein. It agrees with Hume in ascribing to deontological rules some form of social utility, but it is often disposed to find that utility more pronounced in the past, when our hunter-gatherer ancestors lived in small groups and evolutionary forces produced the then functional dispositions that we still find operating in us. Those dispositions strongly inhibit direct interpersonal aggression and violation of interpersonal agreements, and therefore contribute to peaceful coexistence and cooperation. They are efficient because they don't require knowledge of long-term consequences, but respond only to the immediate character of the action and engage the emotions rather than reasoning. In the end, the account is partly vindicating, like Hume's, but partly debunking. It does not set out to discover the moral foundations for our intuitions. Instead, it asks us to take a detached stance toward ourselves and our moral responses, trying to understand ourselves from the outside, so to speak. We then discover, it is claimed, that some of our most confident moral judgments are the product not of reason, but of emotionally charged instinct, created by natural selection. Only after explaining those responses scientifically can we decide which of them we should continue to allow to influence us and which we should instead dismiss as emotional illusions. The conclusion of these psychological critics is that while the evolutionary legacy of deontological morality retains some usefulness as a set of heuristics for identifying the right thing to do much of the time, or to put it in Kahneman's terms, as an example of thinking fast, as opposed to the less efficient but more accurate thinking slow, nevertheless, the only moral standards that are valid in their own right are the rational standards of consequentialism, more specifically some form of utilitarianism. That is the standard that underpins what is useful in the deontological aspects of intuitive morality, and it is also the standard that justifies overriding deontological intuitions when a slower calculation of costs and benefits reveals that they would lead us to do more harm than good. Even with this alleged scientific support, however, I believe it is too early to declare victory for consequentialism. The detached biological stance toward ourselves is now a cultural commonplace. People are accustomed to thinking of their psychological dispositions as the product of natural selection and of their minds and motives as significantly not under their conscious, rational control. But this merely poses the problem of distinguishing between moral appearance and moral reality, and does not yet solve it. Psychologically reductive or debunking accounts of our moral intuitions are not self-validating. They are contributions to the process of reflective equilibrium, and we have to decide whether they are more plausible than the judgments they propose to replace. The problem of appearance and reality is at the heart of philosophy, and it is found in every branch of the subject. It arises when we step outside of ourselves temporarily and consider the way things seem to us, consider the way things seem to us in some respect as a psychological fact, a fact about a certain type of creature in the world. The question then is whether the best explanation of this psychological fact, employing the forms of biological, neurophysiological, psychological, and historical understanding available to us, is compatible with our continuing to affirm that things are as they appear to be from that perspective. We can pose this question whether the appearance is a sensory perception, a memory, a mathematical certainty, an aesthetic judgment, or a moral conviction. However, it is important that when we take this step outside of ourselves, the inside point of view that we are examining does not disappear. We cannot completely withdraw from our own point of view and observe ourselves as if we were someone else. Even when we take up the external point of view, it is still ours. In the cases we are discussing, both deontological intuitions about the wrongness of murder or betrayal and consequentialist intuitions about the goodness of saving more lives rather than fewer continue to offer prima facie grounds for moral belief. And we have to decide whether what appears to the external view will justify us in disregarding some of them. In arriving at such a judgment, we simply have to make use of moral intuitions. Otherwise, we could not draw any moral conclusions. So the question will be whether the external view, scientific, historical, or sociological, of our moral responses convincingly weakens the authority of some more than others. Since the responses themselves participate in this contest, the outcome is not automatic. The debunking force of the external view is more powerful in some cases than in others. For example, I find that it seriously threatens my confidence in the strong intuitions that support retributive justifications for punishment, a particularly plausible candidate for debunking evolutionary explanation. But for the kinds of individual rights we are considering, I believe the outcome of the external challenge remains nearly as problematic as the original moral dilemma. When psychological and neurophysiological data and speculative evolutionary explanations are brought to bear on these judgments, reactions typically diverge in ways that I suspect depend heavily on the reflector's antecedent predisposition for or against a purely consequentialist outlook. Some people just find utilitarianism the only rationally intelligible form of moral justification. Others find it equally obvious that morality has another dimension. For the former, the fact that deontological judgments are arrived at quickly, without deliberation, and that they are associated with emotion, both phenomenologically and neurophysiologically, is a reason to discredit them as instances of moral knowledge, especially since they sometimes require us to do what is clearly irrational, namely choose the greater evil over the lesser. The hypothesis about their evolutionary origin provides an alternative explanation of their emotional force. But for anti-consequentialists, the immediacy and emotional force of reactions against murder, torture, betrayal, and so forth, are not surprising, since they are responses to the immediate moral character of our interaction with another person, rather than to broader consequences. Of course, your ventromedial prefrontal cortex will squirm when you think about murdering or torturing someone. Anti-consequentialists also point to another psychological fact, that impartial benevolence, the motive that is supposed to ground utilitarianism, is far too weak in most human beings to support obedience to its demanding moral requirements, which makes it unsuitable as the sole basis for human morality. As for the evolutionary speculations, they hardly count as independent empirical data. They are really driven by the consequentialist moral theory and can be taken with a grain of salt. In other words, nothing in this complex set of arguments and counter-arguments forces one to abandon either the consequentialist or the deontological position. The main point, as Salim Berker has pointed out, is that disagreements over how to respond to information about the psychology and neurophysiology of moral judgment are themselves moral disagreements. It is certainly legitimate to introduce these findings into the process of reflective equilibrium, but in the end, it is we who have to decide whether they should undermine our confidence in the validity of the deontological judgments they are supposed to explain away. And in this decision, those intuitions themselves play a role. They don't automatically withdraw from the scene in response to an MRI reading. It is not a question of whether the outside view will cause the challenged intuitions to become emotionally weaker. It is a question of whether it convinces us to regard them, whatever their emotional vividness, as mere appearances rather than recognitions of moral reality. After all, optical illusions don't go away as features of visual experience when we learn by measurement that they are illusions. When we regard ourselves and our moral psychology from outside, we still have to decide whether the outside view requires us to withdraw our assent from what is presented as true from the inside. And the inside view is a participant in that choice. I think it is clear from the history of this debate and the tenacity of the two sides that there are two quite different reflective equilibria to be found here, one of which preserves a significant deontological component in morality, and one of which is significantly revisionary. I suggest that in light of this standoff, it is unrealistic for either side to think of itself as having refuted the other. Both are viable moral outlooks. What I want to propose is that we ask a slightly different question. Would a move to the revisionary position count as moral progress? We know that human morality changes over time, and it seems unlikely that it will ever reach a final steady state any more than science will. Instead of saying that some form of consequentialism is the only rational moral outlook, moral revisionists might be understood as offering us a step forward in this journey of moral development. Some examples of moral reform can only be seen as outright refutations of the outlooks they seek to overthrow. This is true of the contemporary revolution in views about homosexuality, which has overridden a very powerful taboo in the name of individual liberty and human happiness, and seems to be on the way to dissolving the emotionally freighted sense of pollution that has for so long sustained the taboo. On the other hand, some proposals for moral progress are simply false, sometimes atrociously so. Both Nazism and Bolshevism were justified, after all, under the color of moral progress. But there are other examples that pose the issue of progress in a different way, as a comparison between possible alternatives. An example that is closely related to the issue before us is that of property rights. The radical hope that private property rights could be abolished in favor of common ownership has turned out to be a destructive dream. But I find utterly convincing Hume's account of property not as a basic moral right, but as a convention sustained by its indispensable contribution to the collective interest of society. And so long as it provides security of possession, succession, and exchange, permitting capital accumulation, economic planning, and cooperation over the long term, the system of property rules and rights can also serve other ends, such as distributive justice. This instrumental anti-Lockean conception of property rights has some currency, but it is resisted by a powerful libertarian strain in Western morality, which continues to have large political influence, especially in the US. So I think the conventionalist, consequentialist conception of property rights, making them a vehicle for social justice, is best presented as a call for moral progress. Reform in the morality of property would mean that property rights came to be widely seen as based not on individual liberty, but on the collective good. Even though individual liberty is an important value and should be protected in the exercise of those property rights that we hold under the collectively valuable property conventions, it should not be seen as the foundation of those rights and should not determine their content. This is an example of how a moral outlook that has considerable intuitive support might be replaced by another that is deemed superior. In my view, replacement of a conception of property rights based largely on liberty and self-ownership by the conventionalist conception would be a clear example of progress. But would it be moral progress if we came to see all deontological boundaries not as fundamental to morality, but at best as rough guides worthy of respect only to the extent that their relatively strict protection actually serves the welfare of society or humanity as a whole? I think that depends on whether it would be progress to simplify the moral point of view. In some sense, the moral point of view requires putting oneself in everyone else's shoes and taking the separate point of view of each individual into account in deciding what to do. The question is, how? The appeal of the consequentialist way of valuing people impartially cannot be denied. It may seem that there is no way to take the points of view of all individuals into account without merging them into a single ocean of benefits and harms, which is then valued as a whole. Yet there is another way. In deontological morality, each individual faces us separately, and the inviolability of the individual facing us dominates the rival claims of those we could help by sacrificing him to the general welfare. I think we feel this even when we put ourselves simultaneously in the place of several potential victims of these two different kinds in a typical dilemma. This individualized moral respect is something that morality can guarantee to everyone equally, the same entitlement to be treated in certain ways, the same status, the same limits or boundaries. It is a condition on the character of our personal interactions with one another. Each person with whom I interact presents me with the same stubborn and impenetrable moral surface that I present to him, certain things may not be done by either of us to the other. And this moral minimum is an expression in the structure of the morality of the demand that moral consideration should respect each individual separately. That is not the case if morality, in principle, permits the complete subordination of one person's interests to the greater interests of others, as is allowed by consequentialism. As Francis Cam has emphasized, such an inviolable status is denied to everyone by any consequentialist system, whatever outcomes it values. The question I am asking is whether, looking at ourselves from outside, we should come to view our attachment to rights and deontology as an underdeveloped moral outlook, one that grossly magnifies the claims of the person facing us and limits our rationality. Would it be progress if we no longer took the individual-centered deontological outlook and the intuitions stemming from it as fundamental moral guides? I believe something would be lost. No doubt, human morality will evolve, and perhaps it will move in a more consequentialist direction. But the completely different way of valuing individuals by treating each of them appropriately, come what may, and demanding such treatment for ourselves, is a vital part of our lives. Most important, it is a distinctive way of thinking about how to relate to one another, the source of our constantly developing interpretations of people's equality of status as the bearers of human rights. Without it, the advantages of membership in the moral community would be seriously diminished, not quantitatively, but qualitatively. Those who disagree will see me as simply begging the question, but perhaps that is unavoidable. Thank you. I don't think that's on.
It's not on. Here we go again. Hello? 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 Yes. So my first question, but please be thinking of yours and we'll get you mics at work. The comparison that you make with optical illusions is arresting. But my question is, once we are shown that there was an illusion, isn't there a claim that the revisionary view is more accurate, that we can't go back?
Right. I introduced that example because I wanted to acknowledge that even when you decide to regard a moral feeling as illusory, the feeling may not go away. It can continue to exist in juxtaposition with your judgment that it is an illusion. So that if someone has strong retributive feelings that people who wrong deserve to suffer comes to believe that that is a kind of hangover from our evolutionary past, and it really isn't justified to make someone suffer just for the sake of paying them back, that won't necessarily make the retributive feelings go away. So you can judge, I mean, you can simply change from endorsing the moral intuitions to regarding them as perhaps ineliminable, but as illusory as you can with optical illusions.
Who would like to identify yourself? Use a microphone that works.
My name's Mark. I'm the one. My name is Mark. My question is, what do you mean by moral progress? So presumably you don't just mean a move towards better consequences. Maybe you mean moving to a better equilibrium. If so, what constitutes that?
Well, I don't think I can give a general answer to that question. I was introducing a form of moral progress which wasn't simply the refutation of a former moral view as false in favor of another one that was true, but a comparison between stages. But the trouble with a request for a general account like that is that I think you can't say anything that isn't trivial about what makes one theory better than another, whether you're talking about science or about morality or about politics. All of the explanation of why a change constitutes progress has to come at a lower level of the comparison between the two outlooks and pointing out the differences between them and eliciting an evaluation of those differences. I mean, that's a deliberately, in a way, it's a deliberate refusal to answer a question that's that general. And I just tried to give an example of both why the revisionists in this case would think that it's moral progress, because it rids us of some baggage that, while it has a historical explanation, we can now do without, and also why one might think that they're wrong because it is ridding us of a category of reasons that can enter into the determination of how we should treat people that enriches our morality. So.
Thank you. Yes, Victor, identify yourself if you would.
Hello, I'm Victor Tadros. So, like you, I have these, or maybe you don't, but I do have these retributivist reactions, which I have retributivist...
Slower, yes.
Slower, okay. I have retributivist reactions that I recoil from and reject. And then the question I had was what role the evolutionary explanation should play in rejecting those reactions. I wondered whether they really played a role, so we could find the explanation why we have these reactions. But I wondered whether that would really make a difference to whether we accepted or rejected them, rather than just reflecting on whether we think we can endorse them when we think of just valuing the suffering of another person. I tend to
Well-
recoil for that reason rather than because of the debunking explanation.
Well, I mean, the evolutionary story or hypothesis would just be a supplementary consideration. I mean, there are all kinds of reasons that might make you doubt the validity of retributive punishment. Problems about free will and the conditions of moral responsibility, the fact that it is introducing more suffering into the world. I should say, by the way, that my retributive views haven't been completely dislodged by all of this stuff. I continue to believe in retributive punishment, but the evolutionary story would be that people being programmed to enforce violations of the conditions of cooperative living with retaliation would have had a stabilizing effect on small groups and therefore might have survived. I mean, if group selection can be made to work. And the reason that if you came to believe that your retributive feelings were the expression of something that had that kind of natural selection explanation, then there's absolutely, we would have had it for that reason, whether it was morally justified or not. We have no reason to take it as the intuitive apprehension of a real reason to do something, because there's an alternative explanation. As it were, the hereditary brainwashing of the evolutionary process. That's the argument. I don't think it's decisive, but it certainly is one reason to distrust these feelings.
Hi, okay. My name's Tim Scanlon. Tom, I'm intrigued by the idea of replacing one set of moral views by another, thought of as an improvement, without regarding the former set as having been shown to be false or mistaken or refuted. If we think of our current moral outlook as having several different components, some perhaps morally fundamental ideas that people simply may not be treated in certain ways, as illustrated by your example of Stuart Hampshire, and others, like what you described as the attitudes that I would share toward property, that they're conventions. And we might think there are a variety of different property conventions, and we might decide that some of them could be replaced by others without deciding that the former had been mistaken or had been refuted, but just moving to these other conventions would be an improvement. So with respect to the conventional part of our moral outlook, that move is clearly possible. I'm having a little bit of trouble getting my mind around the idea of making such a transition with respect to moral ideas that had this more fundamental status.
Well, intrigued, yes. Very tactful. I think this aspect of what I was proposing is certainly problematic, and but I was thinking of the possibility of moral progress in this sort of softer sense, partly on the model of scientific progress, in which in which a later theory subsumes and to some extent explains the propositions of an earlier theory, perhaps finds a more fundamental basis for it, perhaps requires some revision of it, and replaces it. We don't think that the earlier theory has been refuted. You know, Einstein's theory of relativity didn't
That makes sense. I'm
refute.
disintrigued.
Oh,
Yeah, David Luban. Two equilibria which can't dislodge each other without begging the question sounds like an extremely humble role for moral rationality, in that if you're confronted with a dilemma in which those intuitions clash, there's no way of proving that one way of resolving it is right and the other is wrong. So I want to ask first whether I'm understanding you right about the very humble role of moral rationality, and then whether you have a view about whether there's any reasoned way of resolving moral dilemmas where these two fundamental viewpoints clash.
well, in saying that the other side would see me as begging the question, I wasn't really expressing as much hopelessness as you suggest, because I think what I tried to do was to explain why, in spite of the fact that I don't think that I can demonstrate to a consequentialist that he must accept something more in morality. Nevertheless, I was trying to give an explanation or an account of why it's reasonable to continue to believe in deontological aspects of morality, and you know, in difficult cases, cases of difficult disagreement about lots of things, that's the way it's going to be. I mean, the best you can do is to give yourself a justification for continuing to hold the beliefs that you do, in spite of the fact that you can't decisively prove their correctness to others. I think the most we can hope for in difficult subjects like this is justifications that warrant continued confidence. And it just takes time to find out whether in the long run one of these views will come to seem clearly preferable to the other, to the majority of people who think about it. I mean, after all, there has been moral progress, and it has occurred despite the fact that at certain times there have been absolutely irresolvable disagreements. I think that's just the way this works.
Yeah, I had Francis Camp. One thing that struck me was you said that one of the strongest reasons for thinking that deontology has a deeper foundation in rule consequentialism is that when you abandon the deontological principles, you get very poor consequences in the ordinary consequentialist sense of what consequences count. And I was wondering, first of all, why you thought that was true.
Wait, I think there was a misunderstanding there.
You didn't say that rule consequentialists have the right answer. You just said, one strong piece of evidence
Oh, for rule
for
consequential.
rule
Yeah,
consequential
excuse me, I
giving a
didn't hear.
foundational explanation
Yeah.
of these deontological considerations, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, I was wondering why you thought that in fact there was this evidence that we get poor consequences when we abandon the standard deontological restrictions. The elimination of native populations, American Indians, has led to this glorious empire here of the United States. China seems to be doing better than India. It's true that in the short run there was vast murder and slaughter, but the consequentialist view is the long run, right? In the long run. So I'm not sure that you can say that, I mean, this is a double-edged sword. That means that we don't have good consequentialist reasons for thinking that there is this deeper foundation for deontology. But then the other thing that struck me about this comment and your discussion of rule consequentialism was standardly, we think that the use of a hypothetical case, well, okay, suppose it does lead to the best consequences, having these rights and so forth. Suppose it didn't. Hypothetically, just imagine a case, right? And would you still abide by it? Suppose in reality this will never happen, okay? It seems like the consequentialist approach, rule consequentialist, will say hypothetical thought experiments are of absolutely no use at all. What would you expect? Of course you're going to say that the deontological principle, you will adhere to it even if the consequences are bad. That's part of having it ingrained in your system. So I'm wondering whether you think that hypothetical thought experiments have any role in determining whether we think correctly that even if the consequences were bad, there would be reasons for being a deontologist.
Well, I guess I think they do have some role, but I think that actual choices are a better test, and I think that I mean that's why I began with an actual case, but I think that societies have to make these choices sometimes on the basis of what they think will be most effective. And I think that it is evidence that the ontological restraints play a part in the reasoning of some societies, that they will not use certain methods even if they believe that they would increase their chance or reduce the cost of victory in a war, for example. I don't think that this is unheard of. So I prefer to make it depend on what people actually do in actual cases. I also think about, you're right, consequentialists do look to the very long term, and the fact is we haven't had the kinds of the kinds of social and political experiments abiding by or overthrowing human rights that give us the results centuries down the road. But
look at America. I mean, we do have very good results from having oppressed Native people. There's no doubt about it.
oh, yeah, I've seen. I didn't catch
I mean,
that. You're taking the United States as an example of a society that doesn't respect individual rights.
Yeah. Misery and suffering for generations, but those generations are dead and gone now, and very few people seem to remember them, and they're thriving.
We need an even longer view.
Okay.
Big mountain. Down there.
Hi, I'm Dick Fallon. At several points, you alluded
Can
to
you,
the
can you really try to speak loud?
I will
can't.
speak as loudly as I can. At several points, you alluded to the possibility that the future might, in some sense, emerge as an arbiter of the dilemma that you think we face in moral thinking now. I can understand how, easily imagine how future thinking could lead to better deontological theories. I can understand how the future might result in the production of better consequentialist theories. What about the future could possibly emerge as an arbiter of the fundamental dilemma that you see as being at the center of moral thinking, such that the future would somehow resolve whether deontology had a correct place in moral thinking?
No, I don't really. No, I think it's possible that a form of integration between consequentialist and deontological considerations which faced us with fewer dilemmas would reduce the resistance to a morality that's complex in this way. I don't really know. I'm torn between the view that dilemmas are inevitable in morality, and that these two irreducibly distinct ways of valuing people are inevitably going to generate them, and thinking that maybe there is a way of putting it together which will give the right weight and conditions to both of these types of considerations in a way that makes it look more like a single morality. But that's really the only thing I can think of described very abstractly that might satisfy your condition. I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer to that question.
You have awfully good questions, and we are incredibly grateful to you. And people's hands keep going up, but we're going to have to end this part of the conversation. As I do so, I want to give you a framed version of the poster as we celebrate your provocative and insightful contribution on human rights and moral knowledge. Thomas Nagel. Thank you.